Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question came to us from the True Stories collection, as in, it actually happened at an event that I was actually judging. Amy plays an endurance, targeting Nick with its ability. Nick grabs his graveyard and moves to put it on the bottom of his library, but Amy says you have to shuffle it. So, Nick shuffles his graveyard into his library. At this point, Amy calls for a judge. What is the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? So to start things out, Amy has not committed any infractions here. Indeed, it seems like she did her best to try to prevent Nick from committing an infraction, when she intervened before Nick put his graveyard on bottom of his library without shuffling like he was supposed to. Unfortunately, her words were misinterpreted by Nick, who thought that he had to shuffle his graveyard into his whole library rather than shuffling it first and then putting it on bottom of his library. It's kind of hard to convey this sort of thing in just words, but I assure you that if you were there and you saw the actual scenario happen, then it would be pretty clear from that Amy had done all that she could in order to prevent Nick from committing an infraction. So, with that being the case, now let's turn our attention towards Nick and see what infraction, penalty, and fix would be appropriate for what he's done. Given the description from the original problem statement, it seems to me like there's two really promising candidates for what infraction Nick has committed. We could either maybe say that this is a hidden card error because the cards that he shuffled back into his library can't easily be recovered from his library, or we could maybe say that this should be a game rule violation because Nick did not follow the instructions of the endurance correctly. Now, game rule violation is generally meant to be an infraction of last resort, something that you give out only if none of the other infractions really fit what the player did. So let's first take a look and see if hidden card error might be appropriate. And the answer is it's not going to be the appropriate infraction in this specific case because the cards that were put into Nick's library were originally in Nick's graveyard, which is a public zone, which means that the infraction does not involve cards being in a hidden zone immediately before the infraction was committed, and that is one of the prerequisites that it needs to be in order for hidden card error to be applicable. So with that being the case, we can say that the infraction Nick committed would be a game rule violation. The normal penalty for that is a warning, and now we can take a look at what the correct fix would be. And this is where we get into a lot of the really interesting details for this specific scenario. So, with a game rule violation, there are three specific things that we could do that would be policy-supported fixes for a game rule violation. The first one that I want to take a look at would be a partial fix. This is something that you can do if a specific game rule violation has occurred, and there are a handful of specific ones that are listed in the IPG that have partial fixes available for them. So if the infraction the player committed happens to fall in that specific list of infractions from the IPG, then we can perform a partial fix. And partial fixes are generally really great to use because they're specifically tailor-made for some of the most common types of game rule violations. And they generally work better than trying to go back and rewind or trying to leave the game state as is. So let's take a look, and there's one specific partial fix that I feel like a lot of people might be kind of gravitating towards, especially if you're familiar with this section in the IPG. That would be this one here that says that if a card is in an incorrect zone, when we changed zones, then we can take it and move it to the correct zone. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but that's what that giant block of text kind of says. So the problem with this is that we don't actually match this situation exactly. We do have cards that are in the wrong part of a zone, but that's not the same thing as a card being in the wrong zone. And so because the cards being shuffled into the whole library rather than being shuffled into a block that's placed on the bottom of the library doesn't exactly match what this partial fix is saying that we can do, then that would mean that this partial fix is not applicable. You can check in the IPG and see that none of the other partial fixes listed there are applicable too, but I'll just go ahead and tell you that that's the case. So now that we've eliminated that as being a possibility, we have two different possibilities left. We can either leave the game state as it is, or we can back up to the point immediately before the error. Now, usually backups to the point immediately before the error aren't generally going to be possible if you've got some sort of a situation that involves random elements like shuffling a library, but it turns out that because of what we talked about with the hidden card error discussion, that is, the fact that the cards that we shuffled into the library actually were known to both players before that happened, that means that this is a possible thing that we might be able to do. So, now that we've got the situation narrowed down to those two fixes, I think that we're probably going to have to stop talking about exactly what the right answer is, because it turns out that based on the specifics of the case, the right answer could easily be either one of those two things. Both of these are policy supported, so it's up to the judge's discretion for which of these fits the best with the specific case that you're presented with. And instead of trying to go through exactly what happened in the specific case that I encountered this scenario in, I want to kind of talk a little bit about what sort of information that I was looking for and how I used that information to come up with a decision as to which of them would be the correct call in this specific instance. So, because it isn't specifically spelled out anywhere in policy what the actual right answer should be, I can't just pull up something and say this is what it was, but I can talk a little bit about what the things that you should be looking at to decide, and that isn't really a matter of policy that's written down, it's really more of a matter of the overarching big picture philosophy that we're trying to achieve anytime we have an infraction and we need to come up with an appropriate fix for it. So there are 3 specific philosophical points that I'm going to talk about that you can use in these sorts of determinations if you have multiple different fixes and you need to decide which one is the best for this specific case. The word best is kind of loosely defined here, so let's put some specifics on there and talk about the criteria that we'll be using to decide what the best fix would be. So the first criteria that I'm going to talk about is we want to get the game state to exactly what it would be if there was no error committed. And if we can't do that, then we at least want to get as close as possible to what it would be. And so that's the first criteria that we're going to be thinking about, is the fix that we are performing going to get us to the game state that would have existed immediately before the error? Or if not, is it going to at least get us as close as possible? And regarding the question from the original problem statement, I would say that both of the fixes that we talked about really fit about as well as each other in this one. So I would call this a push. And the reason is because, yes, it's true that we are slightly altering the probability that Nick draws a card from his deck that is supposed to be one of those ones in the bottom block of cards that's supposed to be in the endurance. But if you actually run the numbers, it's really pretty low. And if you think about it in context, this is, of course, from a modern game, which means that we're using a modern card pool with modern decks. And if you look at the numbers there, usually you see people shuffling their own libraries in a game of Modern probably about once every 3 to 5 turns. So the total number of draw steps that are going to be impacted by this is, in all likelihood, pretty low. So with that being the case, I would say that yes, there is a difference between backing up and leaving the game state as is, but I would say that it's a pretty small difference, at least as far as this specific philosophical pillar would be concerned. The next philosophical pillar that I want to talk about would be that we want to make it so that the player who committed an infraction is not going to be able to benefit from that infraction. Or at least we want to minimize how much of an advantage the person who committed the infraction is able to gain. So to see what I'm talking about, let's think about a couple of hypothetical examples with this specific infraction from this problem statement, and we can see how much of an advantage that Nick would gain from intentionally committing this infraction. So if we imagine that when Nick did this, his graveyard mostly consisted of a bunch of fetch lands, and it was in a late part of the game where the players had lots of mana available and drawing an additional fetch land would probably not be a draw that you would be happy to see, then you could see that Nick's infraction actually doesn't benefit him. In fact, you could probably say that it actively hurts him, because Nick is reducing the overall quality of the draws that he might receive by taking a bunch of fetch lands that are supposed to be on the bottom of his library and instead intermingling them with his whole library. Nick is effectively increasing his chances that he's drawing a fetch land, which is probably not something that he would want to do at this part of the game. On the other hand, this same sort of logic can work both ways. Let's imagine that instead of a bunch of fetch lands, Nick's graveyard only had a few cards, and among them would be 1 or 2 really high value sideboard cards that are extremely important for the matchup, that had been discarded earlier or otherwise dealt with by Amy. In this sort of scenario, we can see that the exact same logic dictates that Nick is actually improving the overall quality of his draws because he's giving himself a chance to draw one of his high impact sideboard cards that he otherwise would not have really had access to if he would have resolved that endurance appropriately. So you can see that based on the number of cards in Nick's graveyard, we have an idea of how much Nick is changing the probability of his future draws. And based on the quality of the cards in Nick's graveyard, we can see that Nick has an opportunity to potentially influence the quality of his future draws. So using those factors, you can have an idea of about how much of an advantage Nick would be able to gain from committing this infraction in an intentional way. That's another pillar that we need to use to take into account when we're deciding which of the two policy-supported fixes we should enact. We really want to favor the one that gives the player the least amount of benefit. So if we had a scenario where a player could greatly benefit from committing this infraction intentionally, then I would lean more towards backing up, whereas if we had a scenario where the player isn't benefiting himself or is benefiting only slightly, then I would be more inclined to leave the game state as it is. Finally, the third philosophical pillar that I want to talk about is one that doesn't get a whole lot of attention in cases like this. And it's because in most cases, there isn't really a difference between the two fixes that are policy supported. But in this specific situation, I think that it really does have a possibility to be a real deal breaker. This would be the amount of disruption that performing the fix has on the game and the tournament as a whole. So let's consider the case where Nick might have several cards from his graveyard. If we were going to take all of those cards out of Nick's library and put them back into his graveyard, well, we could imagine that searching his library for a long list of one-of cards might take a considerable amount of time to do. Let's remember that as a judge, you have to give the players a time extension to compensate for how long the ruling took. This time extension might cause the players to be the last match playing in the tournament and make everybody else in the event wait for 5, 10, or even more minutes while they finish their match. So it turns out that even if we have a scenario that gets us to 99% of the best possible fix, if that takes a certain amount of time to do, then I might, as a tournament organizer or judge, favor a fix that gets us to 90% of the appropriate game state, but it only takes a couple of minutes to perform. As we can see from this situation, there certainly is a potential for that factor to come into play. It would be very easy to just tell the players to continue playing as normal, and it would be a lot more difficult to have the players find all of the cards that we were going to need to get out of Nick's library and then physically go through his library to pull all of those cards out. This is something that I see a lot of judges, especially newer judges who tend to be more idealistic about what kind of fixes that we can do, struggle with. Sometimes the right play is actually to ignore the fact that we know the theoretically perfect answer and go with the practically good enough and generally accepted by both players answer. And so that's the third pillar that I wanted to talk about when it comes to deciding which of the two policy-supported fixes would be the right one to enact. So with that being the case, hopefully you have the tools necessary to make a decision or a determination on that point if such a situation were to come up in an event that you are a judge in. Finally, I want to take some time to think about what we would do differently at regular rel. All of the preceding discussion is valid for competitive rel, but regular rel has a different set of considerations that you would need to take into account. For starters, the focus is on education and fun when you're doing fixes rather than being perfectly fair and consistent. And so that means that the amount of advantage that the player who committed the infraction might be weighted less, and the amount of fun, that is, getting to play Magic, might be weighted a little bit more. In addition, I wanted to talk about another thing that is probably on some people's minds right now. What if we could remember only a few of the cards that Nick was supposed to have in his graveyard, but not all of them? And that's certainly a situation that I would expect to be representative of what you might see if this happened in a real tournament. I think that it's probably fair to say that players would be pretty sure to remember high-impact splashy spells or important things that happened in the game, but they might not remember the exact sequence or the exact identity of which cantrips, or whether a player played a fetch land at a certain time, or whether a player discarded a land or a creature in a situation that it didn't really matter very much. So you can see that this sort of consideration is definitely something that's worth considering. When you have a situation like this, where the players can remember some of the cards but not all of them, then you have that temptation that you would only take those cards out of Nick's library and put them on the bottom, and not take any of the other ones that were in his graveyard, because you don't know what they were. And it seems like this is a really good idea, but if you read carefully, a backup would involve performing a reverse of all of the actions. And so we can't really say that this is a full, complete backup if we only get some of the cards that Nick shuffled in. And so that means that technically, if you were to do something like this, it would probably qualify as a deviation from the accepted policy. Deviations are something that we need to take really seriously and consider if it really is the best option. And I think that at a competitive rel environment, there certainly are some cases where a deviation might be appropriate with this sort of a situation, but there certainly are some cases where it wouldn't be. Again, this is the head judge's call, and it should be based on their determination of the 3 factors that I considered earlier. However, at regular rel, I would say that I'm a lot more likely to accept this sort of a deviation, and especially if the cards involved are high impact or memorable ones, then I would want to put those cards on the bottom of Nick's library and pull them out, rather than leaving them in the whole library for him to potentially draw later. So those are the factors that I would consider at regular rel. You need to be a little bit different in your analysis, but the factors that you're looking at are the same. The only difference would be how much weight you give to each of them. Finally, remember that especially at regular rel, player satisfaction is a big thing that you can use to guide what your decision-making process leads you to. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.